So that's my only regret around the apology was we didn't take it to the fullest extent. And one thing we didn't get in the apology, in my view,
Tēnā koe, Shane. In today's discussion, let's say, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on the 30 years of the Raupatu settlement, and in particular, your contribution, which was a very valuable one, to ensure that the next generation have a really good insight into what it took to achieve a settlement. So let's start with you maybe sharing a bit about yourself and your connection to the iwi.
Tēnā koe Nanaya. First I want to acknowledge you and what you have contributed over the past 30 years in your role in Parliament and your position and influence you have as a tribal member, which cannot be divorced from the settlement. So thank you for that. So I just want to acknowledge that first. I was born in 1963 in Huntly Maternity Hospital. My parents are Ringa Huanui Solomon and Moira McNichol. Dad's affiliations are Ngāti Mahuta, Horo Marae. But my grandfather was one of the orphans that Te Puea brought down to Tanga. So he was, so we're strongly associated with Tanga Marae and continue to be today. His mother was a Pinga, so we have affiliations to Aotea Harbour. Mum is Mum's dad was from, he was, my great-grandfather was a McNichol, Pākehā. And Dad, my granddad, on Mum's side, was brought up, born in Hokianga, so we had that connection up north. But he was brought down to Ngāti Wairere when my great-granddad went off to war. So he brought my grandfather to Ngāti Wairere, so we have a strong connection there. So that's our general whakapapa. So we're a bit from the east coast, a bit from up north, and a bit from Waikato.
All the good bits.
All the good bits. If I start with how I got involved, and it was Uncle Binga telling your father that I'd just come back from London. You know, this young lawyer, he set up an interview with your dad, and Myrtle called me, say, oh, Mr. Mahuta would like to have an interview with you on such and such a date, such and such a time. So I went to the interview at the old Centre for Māori Studies and Research, and what I recall was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was April 1992, and going up the stairs in the stained glass, and being interviewed by your dad. He just goes, so you're the grandson of Te Hau? I said, yes. And your father's ring? I went, yes. He goes, and do you play for Chonawai? I said, no. So I played for Norway Rugby Club. And he goes, well, you got the job. Go and see Mercer and sort out the details. So he literally interviewed me on my whakapapa.
Have you ever been interviewed on whakapapa before?
No.
No. And when you cast your mind back to that early discussion around the interview, what were your first impressions when you met Sir Robert?
I thought, who are you? I had no idea, to be quite honest. And I think there's nothing distinguishable. But later I found out, how wrong I was, how much mana and power was in the man. But he was just like a normal person. And he goes, oh, yeah. He said, go see Mercer. Okay. And Mercer goes, do you know how to use the computer? And I lied and said, yeah. So I had to learn quickly on the job. But it was fine. It was, I think, on reflection, he was looking for generational servitude of families. So that's why he asked me about my grandfather and my father. And he goes, well, it was Papahero service. We all service Tanga. So I think that was his only criteria that he wanted.
Can you explain your connection to Uncle Binga or Kamirahegi?
He's my uncle on the Pingareka side. So that's from Aotea Harbour. And through my grandmother, Dad's mum, is our connection. But we've always had, growing up, a strong connection with the Haggies. As kids, we all play together, fought together. So again, it was all that whānau relationships and connectivity. And I think Binga was always proud of mine being one of the first lawyers to graduate and become a lawyer out of the family. And it was just to brag about it. So, yeah, there was a strong connection there. And I was always hoping that I got the job with your dad on my merit rather than on Binga. Binga say so. Said, oh, if you give the nephew a job.
So just explain what you were doing in the UK as a young lawyer and what brought you home.
It was probably 89 I went over, and I just wanted to see the world. And do the 2-year visa thing, overseas experience. So my first job over in the UK was a lifeguard at the Hero Leisure Centre. And then I just used to go flying out to different countries in Europe. And London was just the base. And winter came, I thought, well, I'd better get an inside job. So I became solicitor for the Department of Trade and Industry. So I did that for a while. But the main thing was just to travel around. It wasn't to work. It was just to work to pay my rent and get enough money to go off to Italy or France or Spain,
So you got your law degree, went and did your 2 years overseas study, did a whole lot of things and experienced a whole lot of things, came back, met Uncle Binga organised the interview, and then you got this job. What was your first job? Was it at the university or with the trust board?
I couldn't work it out. I think it was both. But it was with the Centre for Māori Studies and Research. And I was a researcher Yeah. And that's where I met the likes of Barbara Harrison, James Ritchie. I remember James because I witnessed his affidavit for the whole court case back in '89. Helen DeBarry, Myrtle, of course, and John, Bo Puhatu. So, yeah, there's a lot of group of us that were doing the research, basically. So, what I recall was that the centre had been given not permission, but the right to just solely focus on the Raupatu, on the negotiations, which was, I must add, and acknowledge that the university supported us in those negotiations by allowing us not to be teaching or researching anything else but the Raupatu negotiations.
And as a young lawyer, I would imagine that at the time you were, a whole lot of issues were thrown at you because you were a lawyer. Were there experiences that you had in compiling the research for the Raupatu that you thought, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but I've been asked to do it? And what were those types of experiences?
Oh, every day, yeah. My experience as a lawyer had been commercial. So I was, my original engagement was as solicitor for the Official Attorney's Office. So I was liquidating companies and prosecuting and all that sort of stuff, but nothing to do with that side of the law. And it was very challenging, but very exciting at the same time. And my first job that Bob, Sir Robert gave me was to do the Crown Forest Rental Trust report on Onifero and Maramarua forests. And I did that with Kim Barker. Yeah, so we put that together, and it was the first actual report that went through the Crown Forestry Rental Trust that was approved for, that they agreed that these lands belong to the iwi. So that's back, before settlement time.
That's interesting because Onefero and Maramarua, while a part of the Raupatu settlement, hasn't actually been resolved at the moment. And have you got any reflections on, the outstanding matters of Maramarua?
Onefero, no, that was fine, because that was not contested. But Hauraki contested Maramarua. And I just think part of the treaty settlement process does involve those crossovers and cross claims, but how they're resolved should be based on tikanga rather than through the judiciary or the legal process. And unfortunately, what I recall was we tried to get the kaumātua from both sides to resolve the issue. But, to be quite honest about this, the young people took a legal position and took it through the legal process as opposed to going through a tikanga process. And it would have been resolved much quickly, and our whanaungatanga would have been not disrupted.
So just so I'm clear, because it's an outstanding issue of the settlement, in your mind, tikanga is the way to resolve the Maramarua lands issue between Waikato and Hauraki?
Yeah.
And were kaumātua to be brought into that conversation what do you think the ultimate outcome or beneficial outcome would be in terms of the relationship between the two iwi?
I think it would have been a mutual ownership or mutual guardianship of the forest and the land, so that we acknowledge that, yes, we are part one and the same, and we can share this, because the enemy is not us, it's the Crown. So that I think that will have been resolved quite quickly. But at the end of the day, we got caught in the settlement process, and what the outcome was defined by the process, which was we would be paid so much money, but we didn't get the whenua back.
So we have covered off the work that you did, which was seminal in terms of informing the Raupatu. Part of that was the Onewhero and Maramarua papers that yourself and Kim Barclay-Kerr had developed. Were there other key bits of research informing Raupatu that you were intimately involved with?
The return of Raupatu and Te Hau, and developing the Custodial Trust, which was, again, before pre-settlement. So those lands were returned as a sign of good faith by the Crown. And we had to develop this, which was, I found, for me personally, was quite exciting, was the development of a customary title that wasn't Māori land or general land, but was a unique title. And I think that's been underplayed. It's not really been highlighted that the innovation around creating a title that reflected the position back in 1863 and the tuku of the tribe to the Tanga of the lands. And had to also, on reflection, acknowledge the Anglican Church for their role in the return of Raupatu, because they were the original owners of the land when it was taken on the Public Works Act to build the military base here. But they also acknowledged that they had been gifted the land to establish a native school. And they said that they weren't going to exercise their Section 40 right under the Public Works Act, that the land should be given back to the tribe as the original owner, rather than to them as the legal owner under the Public Works Act regime. So, yeah, I just thought that was very generous of them to do that, but to acknowledge the history of the place.
Giving land back at that particular time was really a novel approach for the government of the day.
Oh, it was.
And I'm wondering if you can recall the conversations about the sign of good faith and to give Hopu and Te Rapa, both defence bases, yes, both taken under the Raupatu, where the church had, in this instance, for Hopu an interest. But can you recall what was the motivation for the Crown to say, as an act of good faith, we're going to give these two pieces of land back?
I think the motivation actually, again, my own personal reflection, came from Doug Graham, and that he wanted to make sure that the negotiations were fair and honourable, but also that the two Te Rapa and Raupatu were both surplus to requirements. So that was a good place to start. And it wasn't really based on you were after me, hoki mai, as they was taken, so they should be returned. It was more a negotiation strategy of replacement, because they really didn't get our position around you after me, hoki mai, till later in the negotiations, when it did click that we weren't after cash, we were after land.
Well, that's an important point, because in order to build trust between the two negotiators, Sir Doug Graham and Sir Robert, that step, I would imagine, would have been quite a critical step to engender confidence in continuing the negotiation process.
Oh, it was absolutely critical. And I think it was also down to the relationship between Sir Robert and Doug Graham, their personal relationship and respect for each other, and the rangitira ki rangitira approach that your dad insisted upon, because he wouldn't deal with the officials, as you know. Some of them he told to go away. So it was not a gentleman's arrangement, but at that level of it took it out of the transactional mode into something more. So it was about, it became more important than just doing a simple land swap or a land gifting back. And I think that was, for me, the two things around the return of Raupatu and Te Rapa. The two things were the acknowledgement of Te Hau and the return of land. As land was taken, it should be returned. But also the Crown accepting our bottom line principle in negotiation and realising what it was, but acknowledging that the Raupatu was probably at the high level of grievance, and that in putting into the title of Te Whetowhetho.
Well, let me come to the title of Te Whetowhetho and the custodial title that you were quite excited to work on. Were there international models or examples of this kind of idea, or how did you develop and foster this concept of a custodial title?
We looked at kakadu over in Australia, but there was nothing. There's no model. I think it was...
Did you visit Kakadu? Is it Kakadu? Is it? Yep. Did you visit there and...
Yeah, and looked at the arrangement there. But that was more later, on reflection, is more around the acknowledgement of the title and the land and the policy stuff. But to be quite frank, it was literally your dad having this light bulb moment, and saying, but put it into the Whetowhetho title, because a deed man can't sell land. That was his initial concept. And the custodial trustees would be Tiata, as head of the Kauri Ariki, not as Whenitanga, but as head of the Kauri Ariki, and Tūmati and your dad as general representatives. So in terms of those positions, her position was by succession. So there would always be the head of the Kauri Ariki, who was at the time, would be a custodial trustee, and the other two would be by the will of the people, who the people wanted in there. So my understanding at the moment is that those two positions are still vacant and need to be filled. So that process was quite specific and purposeful, that it should be by the people saying who they wanted to fill those two positions.
So democratically elected amongst the tribal membership.
Yeah. So anyone could be put into that position if democratically elected to it.
And in terms of those lands that are under custodial title, which jurisdiction has the ability to arbitrate or have a say on these lands? Is it the Māori Land Court or the General?
No, the Māori Land Court has no say in any of our settlement lands, and that was put into the legislation, our settlement legislation. And I think purposefully that we said, no, we don't want the Māori Land Court to tell us what to do. And that was also partially as a consequence of the litigation by local, by the hapu, saying that the ownership should go back to hapu. But the settlement wasn't a hapu settlement, it was an iwi settlement, and collective loss, collective benefit. And it's only, and I understand that argument, and I understand the hapu position, but it's by fortune that they still had their lands, whereas the rest of us, we had no land to be returned. So it was a deliberate part of the negotiation, again, one of the principles alongside Irewa Whenatu me Hoki Whena Mai, that it should be a collective benefit because of the collective loss that we all suffered.
The substantial part of the Raupatu settlement was based on the return of land, as you've said, but there were also outstanding claims that were identified. And I'm curious to know why, at the time, the negotiating team, yourself alongside Sir Robert, didn't try and agree to everything all at once.
We did at the start, as you know, the statement of claim that was lodged with the Waitangi Tribunal was around the lands, the harbours, the 4 West Coast harbours, and the Waikato River. And fisheries was added later. And we did start off having a comprehensive package. That's what we're going to negotiate. But it quickly became quite clear that even just doing arguing the river was a bit hard. And we didn't want we wanted the ownership of the river. But that wasn't going to happen in those times, at that time. I think it was Miri Taka that just said, the Crown did offer us the bed of the river back, but not the water. And Auntie Miri Taka, she goes, well, what's the point of having the bed without the water? So on that point, we said, well, let's put that to the side. Let's focus on what we can do, which is the land for land, and we reserved the rest of the claims, the harbours and the river, to another time.
What of the settlement do you believe is the, I guess, the pinnacle of the whole settlement process? What aspect of the Waikato settlement is unique and bespoke that you're really proud of in terms of how you contributed?
I think it's all bespoke. The whole thing was bespoke and innovative. There's no blueprint we could work off, both us and the Crown. And we were kind of making up as we went along, And I think as soon as my doctorate points out that we weren't driven by Crown policy, we were driving the tika of settlement. And I refer to that as the humanity of settlements, as opposed to the infrastructure of settlement. So the humanity was, firstly, for me, the proudest thing was the apology. That the Crown apologised to the tribe for unfairly labelling us rebels and for the consequence of the Raupatu. I thought also that getting the Crown acknowledgements, which I think for the future generations, they should really look hard at that, because of what's happening now in our current climate, as those acknowledgements don't mean anything. Create a new era of cooperation. I said, there's no cooperation happening here. There's no era, because era is spelled in a different way now. And I think the old people, really, that's all they wanted. They weren't bothered about any other financial redress. They just wanted that apology to be given. And again, I had to acknowledge Denise Henare and Anne Parsonson and Nelly for fighting hard for every word in that apology. And one thing we didn't get in the apology, in my view, was they didn't say it was they acted illegally, but they acted unjustly. And we want to say, no, that was illegal. They said, we can't put that in. You're going to say unjust. But it was illegal. So we conceded on that. So that's my only regret around the apology, was we didn't take it to the fullest extent that we wanted. But that's the nature of negotiations. You compromise along the way.
So with your legal brain on, had the acknowledgement of illegal been included, what would have been the effect of that?
Oh, they would have been held legally accountable. Just saying, oh, I'm sorry, it was unjust. It was like saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to steal it, but I just accidentally did. So we couldn't have enforced anything. Any action, subsequent action of the Crown, we would say, no, that's illegal. Under our apology, it's illegal. And in today's climate, we can just say, that was you're acting illegally. But we can't say that now. So that was my legal thinking.
There are key aspects of the settlement, as you've said, were innovative. Actually, the whole settlement was innovative. One of the defining aspects of the Waikato Raupatu settlement was the inclusion of a relativity clause. Can you remember how you got to the idea of a relativity clause and then how it all rolled out?
That was classic. And most seriously, that was the highlight. And as I said, every part of the settlement process was innovative, but that was like, somewhere else. So we had Huia Iwi at Tonga Waiwai, and the Crown presented to the tribe what it was going to offer, and Denise Henare presented on behalf of the tribe as to what we were negotiating. And there was a secret ballot, the famous secret ballot, that people would say, did they support Sir Robert going forward to conclude negotiations or settlement? And it was so secret. They had the yes box down on the on the main floor of the Kimura in the no box on the stage. Okay. Oh, Bob, that's not a secret ballot. So those who were opposed to the settlement had to go up on the stage and cast their vote. But in a nutshell, the consequence was that the majority of people said yes, they had supported Sir Robert to finalise the negotiations. So they didn't say what, but they just said, no, whatever he came up with is fine with them. So we all, the Crown team had left and he'd gone to Raupatu to wait for us. And we were doing the votes on the ballot. Then we went back to Raupatu to join the Crown officials. I think the minister had already decided to go back to Auckland, but he came back after he heard the result of the ballot. And we started finalising the details of what the heads of agreement would look like. And that's when your dad and Doug Graham went for their cigar walk around the fields of Raupatu, and they told both of the officials and ourselves not to stay where we were. They were going to be accompanying them. But your dad had earlier that evening, about 6 o'clock I think, told me and Denise and Tom Moke to meet Brett Shepherd at Miri Power Station, where Brett gave us the formula for the relativity clause. And the relativity clause was quite simple, just basically says the effect of it was that we would always be the biggest settlement. So if anyone was bigger than us, we'd be topped up. It wasn't say, for example, that you can't get more than us. And say if you get, please do get more than us, then we can be topped up. Remain the largest settlement because of the risk we took in being first to settle. Who knows what future settlements would look like. They could be much bigger than the 170 that we got. So we came back with Brett Shepherd's formula. That was what, and I don't know what the conversation was, none of us know. Only Bob and Doug Graham would know what that conversation was. But as I understand it, Doug Graham, after a number of calls to Bill Birch and Jim Bolger, agreed to the relativity clause, which was actually the deal breaker. If we didn't get that, there wasn't going to be a deal without the relativity.
When they came back from the long walk and announced a relativity clause, can you remember the look on officials' faces and what? Yeah. What was it like? What was the reaction like?
Well, firstly, the negotiations were driven by Treasury. They were the main driver. And Matthew Palmer was the Treasury official. And he was terrified because no one understood what the fiscal implications were of the envelope, the relativity clause. And they just had put out the fiscal envelope policy, capping settlements at $1 billion, all settlements. So what impact would they have on the envelope? Well, frankly, we blew the cap on that night. And I said, and people were criticising time before buying into the envelope. Said, no, we blew it. You know, and not only with the relativity clause, but we insisted upon interest to be paid, which came up about $30 million. So we literally blew the cap because everything had to be benchmarked at 170. But to answer your question, he was horrified, mortified. But the rest of the officials were happy. Yeah, if not for the support of Bill Birch, I think, and Jim Bolger supporting Doug to agree to the relativity, there would be no settlements today.
That final agreement to the settlement after the relativity clause had been inserted, how did that work out in terms of consenting environment? I'm wondering, you know, there were obviously the iwi go-ahead and the secret ballot or the not-so-secret ballot to get that go-ahead. Then there were the final negotiations where the relativity clause got everything across the line. But that consenting environment and the role that Te Ata played, that the tribe played, you know, to get that agreement to move and sign and finalise the settlement. How did that all work out?
I think the highlight for me was that night. It wasn't really the signing of the deal settlement, it was the signing of the heads of agreement and how everyone was at Maramarua waiting. And you had the old people, you had Te Ata in the background, you know. It was just the anticipation of something magic about to happen that night. And everyone just knew it was the right thing to do. I mean, it wasn't, the settlements aren't perfect, but for the time and the circumstance, it was appropriate. And it had to happen there and then. So I do remember Te Ata washing up her teacups and stuff, and the press secretary for Doug Graham saying to her, oh, gee, lady, we're about to sign the settlement. No, we're about to sign. Would you like to come and witness? Come to it.
Well, they're the tea lady.
And the tea lady just turned and had this big grin on her face. Didn't say a word. It was those kind of things, the humanity of settlement. Well, you were there, so you know what the feeling was. And then we went up to, they signed his agreement. We had the relativity clause inserted, wasn't typed up because Mercer and Joyce are doing typing of the heads of agreement copies. But we had to handwrite and insert the relativity provision. And then we went up to Taipei for karakia in the dark, middle of the night. And the Crown officials came with us and the minister. And I think for me that was the most pivotal moment of the negotiation process. Just having that done. Because the deal settlement for me was the infrastructure. It was just the nuts and bolts. But the humanity had been done that night.
I want to touch on the phrase you used, actually, which is the humanity of settlement and people, and the people that were around that helped to push this kaupapa towards its final destination, or, you know, which was settlement. Who were the people in your mind, and there were many, that helped shape your thinking and supported you so that you could contribute in the way that you did?
And that's a very good question, at the risk of missing people out, which I will inevitably do. But it was everyone. It was the kaumātua, particularly from Mahipa and Tonga. It was the trust board members at the time. Uncle Binga, Hari Pohi, Carmen Kirkwood, Julie Bay, all of the trust board members. Because I always used to think, because I was in my 30s, why am I hanging out with these old people? These are my friends. Why haven't I had people over these old people as my friends? And I think for me, the humanity of settlement means that it was more than transactional. It was transcendental. It wasn't about doing a contract or doing a deal. It was about making right a wrong, not restoring mana because we never lost it, but acknowledging the mana that had been taken from us through the Raupatu and the return of our lands. The apology was so key, and Nene Subira,
Ngāhina ina.
Nahina, she was so important in developing the wording around the apology. So we had the apology in English, and she put the apology in Māori so that we could give us some more wairua into the apology, which the Crown were quite fearful of what we were saying in the Māori version. But key people were everywhere.
The old people played a significant role all the way through the settlement process, the negotiations, engaging with the iwi, and supporting the team. Was that by chance, or there was a committed group of old people that, were appointed to go around? How did that all happen?
It's all organic. They were like our korowai, protecting us. And they wrapped themselves around us to make sure that we were safe. They weren't too into the detail of the negotiations. They just wanted to make sure the process, we were protected in the process. And I think I've always wondered this, how that happened. And I think it just happened. They just all came together knowing this was a big kaupapa they had to have, and there being like the Coalfork case, and they all come together on that. And it was continuation, I think, from there, that they all would be involved. But it also was, I think, not part of your dad's strategy, but part of his thinking was to deliberately bring them on board and allow them to be part of it. To say, yes, you can, this is part of us. You're part of the process. You're part of the negotiations. And I think they just wanted to do it. And what for us, for me, I think personally, was the most valuable tool we had for negotiations was their support. And their constant reassurance, you're right, just carry on, keep going. But also knowing that if we did step out of line, they'll smack us. They do it that way. And I remember distinctly, because when I was, obviously we had critics in opposition to the settlement, and they'll be young and smart and criticise the critics, and they go, no, what they have a value that what they say is right, and so get back in line, be humble, show humility, and not judgment, and I really respected them, and without them, I don't think I would have continued.
They provided that safety.
The safety and the wisdom and the tikanga. Again, it's not transactional. What you're doing is kaupapa. What you're doing is around tikanga. So keep it in that safe space.
What did you observe in terms of the critics? Because there were different types of critics, and for example, how did you observe Sir Robert's interaction with critics, and did he treat different critics differently?
Yeah,
if I can put it like that. Yeah.
He did. And there's no secret. Eva was a big critic to the settlement. And he would always respond to her respectfully. And I do remember one Maramarua tōpa meeting, and he gave us Seymour standing up and yelling and doing the haka and all that sort of stuff. He goes, you respond to him. And they say, if there was the likes of Eva, he would respond to her. But if there's a rangatahi, he'll say, you respond to that.
And that was a way of managing himself, I suspect, because the relationship I recall with, for example, Whaia Eva was a very respectful relationship. And everything she said in public, she said directly to him. So there was no confusion about her intent. Was it your observation that the judgments that needed to be made in order to move forward, despite the criticisms, were calculated judgments, on balance? And still, I think what I'm asking is, there would have been a weight of responsibility to decide to move forward with the settlement because of the level of criticism. Did the weight of that ever deter decisions of the team from moving forward?
No. We acknowledged the criticism or the objection, but what was the alternative? There was no alternative. And again, it was a matter of time and circumstance at that time that we had to go forward. There's nothing else that we could do. There's no alternative that could be achieved apart from not settling, and that was not going to happen. And we had got to that point where the Crown had finally understood because they didn't really get it. And I think it was the difference between us and Ngāi Tahu was that we were focused on the land redress as opposed to cash. And I'm not saying that as a criticism on Ngāi Tahu, because that was the only alternative they had. Once they had been accepted by the Crown as our fundamental, foundational negotiation point, there's no going back.
The weight of responsibility of the negotiating team, I would imagine, was quite heavy during those key moments of forging ahead against the backdrop of an anti-sentiment towards the fiscal envelope.
Yep.
People saying that Waikato was selling out, people criticising you all individually and collectively as the negotiating team. How did you cope with those types of, feelings?
I just, personally, I just took your father's lead. He was going ahead no matter what. He was courageous. He knew what the outcome was going to be. There was no other outcome. It had to be what we did. I remember there was the 10 most wanted list put out around iwi leaders who were selling out the motu under the fiscal envelope. And your dad was on that list. I think it was Chiefney first, Graham Latimer, and then your dad. I thought, but to answer your question, you just felt it was right. It had to happen. And we were quite clear that we weren't buying into the fiscal envelope. We made it explicit in the heads of agreement that we do not accept the fiscal envelope. That was put into the agreement. So despite what others tried, and I think a lot of them don't realise that we had actually put into that arrangement with the Crown that we weren't accepting the fiscal envelope. We were quite clear about that. And that also, in addition, that the settlement was for Waikato, no other tribe. We weren't going to influence or affect any other tribe. It's just for us, the outcome. So we ensured that we didn't prejudice anyone else.
I want to talk about the challenge years to the extent that we want to learn from the last 30 years of settlement and lift up the learnings in a positive way in order to move forward. But those early years of the settlement, there were challenges. And if you were to characterise in terms of the themes of those challenges, what do you think we should be learning from in terms of the themes of the challenges?
I think the first one would be communication. And what I mean by that is that we went out every weekend for the first years of negotiation to the marae to tell the people what was happening. But not only that, we did it for our own internal comms, but we also went out to the wider public. And I think one of the criticisms I have of that process of the Crown was they never had a public relations program for the general public to say, no, as soon as we went out, said, no, we're not going to take your land, we're not after your farm, we're not after your private lands, we're just after Crown land. So that was getting that message across, and once that happened, the general public were fine. They weren't afraid of this unknown thing called treaty settlements, because it never happened before. I think the other thing too was that once we had settled, there was the tension between growing that investment and delivering safe back to the people. And that was really a hard position to try and navigate, because I said, well, we're now $250 million tribe, so how do we get back? But also, how do we grow for the future? And I think the main thing that was always the main message was, it's not our generation that will benefit, it will be the future. So we're not going to see any benefit from the settlement. It will have to be the next following generation. So we're now at the 30-year point, and I think that's where that investment is starting to make a return. Relativity again as part of that generational forecast. That no, it's not going to be, I won't benefit from it, but the future will. And I think we all kind of thought that was the right thing to do. There were some challenges from some of our critics, like providing housing, that the rent should be free and all that. I said, well, come on. And I guess it's really going back to that collective loss, collective benefit paradigm. We plan for the future. Yeah, because the settlement wasn't, as you know, significant in terms of return, redress. Even the lands were less than 2% of what was taken. The dock estate was retained by the Crown, much to my annoyance, which was half of the Crown holding at the time. Yeah, so it was really needing to have to build that capacity to become commercial and build on our investments. And I think the first 5 years was trying to do both at the same time and try to meet the social needs of the tribe, but as well as trying to grow and invest in a portfolio that would provide that. So I think that's where the pressure came in, that we're investing in things that we thought would be, make a quick return so that we can meet the social requirements.
The tribe also went through quite a litigious phase. In reflection, it seems nonsensical, really, that we would go through a process of taking ourselves to court. Have we learnt anything from that time, and how, and if we have, what would we be vigilant about so that we don't go down that road again?
For me, I think it was bizarre. Like, why are we taking ourselves to court? 2 years of litigation against ourselves, a number of different court cases. I think the mistake that we had made was that when we had resolved the trust board and replaced it with a new entity, that we did not define properly the rules of that entity. So what I'm saying is that we voted on what the entity should be, but we didn't vote on what their power would be or their role would be. And I think that's where we got unstuck. So we ended up with the Marae-based Te Hau, now Te Whakatikina and Taura. But there is no clarity around what the powers of those different entities would be. So it was Taura ultimately the decision maker. We had to go back to the wider, bigger group. So we came up with an incorporated society, which is fine, but we didn't define what that power would be or agreed upon by, so I think for me that was a big mistake. We had to be if I had to go back, I would say, this is what you're responsible for. This is what you're not what you're responsible for. Yeah, and I think that's where the TK became unstuck. We got too corporatised, and the corporate mode took over. And I think that's how we ended up in the first case in court. Was against Tiata and your dad. Okay. I just did not understand why Tiata had to be pulled into it. I mean, your dad, him and I had a conversation saying, well, he was prepared to be challenged and taken to court, but we just didn't understand why she was brought into it.
So that's a learning to a large degree, that we, while keeping each other accountable in leadership positions, is a necessary part of our governance structure, that whole process of being litigious in a way that's anti-constructive, that erodes our sense of representation. I think that's an area where it's unnecessary to replicate any of that history.
Yeah, and the reputational damage, that was the worst part, you know. Because I know that, you know, there was that economic commercial crisis that we suffered. But at the same, you know, $40 million devaluation of our investments. But at the same time, I remember, you know, Air New Zealand, BNZ, having $1 billion devaluation, but no one cared. But we were always on NPR about our woes.
In fact, the reporting of Tainui in those early years was terrible. I mean, it was as if the devaluation point, I mean, the media made it seem like Māori couldn't manage their commercial affairs, yet it was happening as out across the market with other companies and organisations as well. It was, I mean, do you have a view on the way that the media reported, the tribe's affairs?
They were racist. They just wanted to see us fail. You know, they wanted this tribe that had done a settlement 5 years beforehand is now on the ship. They just wanted to see us fail and prove everyone that you know Māori can't be commercial or make money or so. To answer your question, it's just pure racism, in my view.
So those challenge years characterised by the, I guess, poor understanding of resolving historical injustice out amongst the public. The fact that we had internal challenges, you know, that litigious period, trying to bed down our governance structure, and then, you know, ongoing media reporting putting the tribe in a negative light. Do you think we've moved beyond that now, or do you think there's elements of challenges in terms of the public awareness of what the tribe is all about?
I think we moved beyond that. I think the major step that we took was to develop a disputes resolution process so that we don't litigate ourselves. We resolve our dispute internally. I think that was, again, blowing my trumpet. It was one of the highlights. One of the highlights I managed to, put forward was our hoho tono process, and I actually think it's quite beautiful. But what really hacks me off is that we haven't used it.
Well, that might be a good thing.
Oh, it's a good thing, yeah.
But the point, to your point, having tikanga as a means of resolving disputes rather than a court process is a far better outcome.
Oh, no, if anything, if any tribe needs to find something else, it's a hoho tono. Because, our tikanga was determined by a Pākehā judge. And the first court case, he just said, well, you're just like a tennis club. In a cooperative society, you're just like a tennis club. There's nothing more, nothing less. Whereas with hoho, everyone's manners kept intact.
That's a really important learning over the last 30 years, is to try and find ways forward where mana and everybody's mana is kept intact while keeping everybody accountable as well.
Yeah.
We have to learn a lot more around how to do that well.
Yeah, and I think that's our evolution, and I think that's one of the gifts we use for the future. It's like, you carry this, develop it, how you evolve it, keep going, because it's not static. It's always going to be organic, and there'll always be time and place and circumstance that determines what that looks like. And I always, when I'd done my PhD, I always wanted to have the critic, the opposition voice in the story, because though we may disagree with each other, their position is valid as mine. So, I'm not saying you're not valid. I'm saying your voice is valid, but we just took a different position at the time, and we went down this route.
I don't think groupthink was ever fostered in the team that you were a part of, that Sir Robert led, because he couldn't stand groupthink. He wanted people to have robust views and ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
And contest each other's kind of positions and come out with something, that everyone could say, yeah, that's the best of our thinking. Do you think we've lost that?
I think, if I was to be honest, I think your dad was so unique because he allowed us to know. He said, well, what do you think? And we were scared, like, I don't know. But he encouraged us to think for ourselves and to challenge him. Well, what do you think? And I'm going to be quite honest, I think that kind of leadership we don't have at the moment. It's all about a cookie cutter format. This is what is supposed to happen, or this is what the textbook says, but it's not what our head says or our heart. And I do think that we have lost that to a large degree because we become a bit entitled, if I can say that.
You can say that. We're here at the college, and the college in many ways represents our aspiration for the future. How do we, as a tribe, foster curious minds that will take our tribe beyond the next 30 years?
I think the college is key to that, but it's not a building. It's a place of minds gathering. And I think the original concept, which is still there, is the think tank. Where's the think tank around what's happening at the moment? Where's the research that's required to happen so that we can put into action that thinking? I remember back in the day, Maramarua tōpū was packed. If you get Kimi Ora packed, that's a big hui. But there was lots of minds happening at the time. The conversation was rich and robust. And I think the challenge for us is to always have something to fight for or fight against. I keep going, what's our form of position happening around the coalition manifesto? That is so ripe. So ripe to attack or to challenge and put our view, but our voice is silent. I can't hear us. I can't hear a collective voice. Maybe do it individually, but there's no voice. And again, I go back to the fact that it was around Sir Robert's leadership that we were always leading the motu on those challenges. We did the fisheries, we did first Crown Forestry Rental Trust report, in the Raupatu negotiations, the challenges we did with the split of ECNZ. We were leading that, but we're failing to take those opportunities now. Not that we're not incapable of it, it's just that we're not doing it. I mean, I'm a fanboy of your dad, but realistically, there's that leadership. And it's not a temporary leadership, it's a permanent one, a life one.
What do you think are the challenges, or if you were to vision out opportunities for the next 30 years, what would you like to see?
I don't know how you describe it or express it, but I like to see our mana motuhake be natural, be part of everyday life, part of our recognition within New Zealand society, that we have our mana, we have our independence, we have our rangatira Tanga. And I really hope that, for me, it's about education, that we become elite, that the tribe has this brain that we can drive our initiatives, overcome obstacles, and everything that's been put up, that we don't, everything that oppresses us again, that we can challenge that, and not just challenge, but win that challenge. Because Sir Rob always said, don't go to war if you're not prepared to win. If you're not prepared, then don't go to war. So I think that is one of the opportunities. Is really, again, it's my personal bias. It's coming back to the college. We do our own research for ourselves, and how we put that research into action. So it's not just about statistics, it's about outcome. Yeah, and just maintaining that. I think it's really about the wairuatanga for me, for myself personally, the last 35 years. Without that wairuatanga, I would not have survived. In fact, I have survived. I'm quite happy I'm very privileged, to be honest, and happy with my life. That has been moulded around the tribe, the old people, my peers, like Bob, I do count him as a peer, Denise, John, Tom, Mira. And I think, I'm just thinking, what more could you ask for? My wife, the whole fabric is about whatever. I mean, I should not have done it without it. Yourself, your sister, your mother. So I'm very lucky.
We're very lucky. Socrates said education is like kindling for the fire. And you, in gathering your thoughts together and putting it into a PhD that the college can now use as its seminal text for the settlement, is a gift.
Yeah.
So I want to acknowledge that, and I want to, the discipline of being able to set down in writing those experiences, first-hand experiences that you had, I think is a critical part of commemorating the 30 years of the settlement. And it's my strong view that, Shane, in having this conversation with you, We should be able to draw a line under the, underneath all those rich learning experiences, good and bad, so that we can push the waka to the next destination. So I want to thank you for that.
And I think that was my purpose, was leaving something for the next generation to be able to forge ahead in their own way, but understanding what happened back in the day. And what Denise always says are the fish hooks we leave for the future, so they can grab those fish hooks and take advantage of that, particularly in today's climate, which has become very real now.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to share for the purposes of this conversation?
It's all about personal journeys, and mine has been a fantastic one. It's been ups and downs, but on the whole, it's been magic. I think I really need to acknowledge your dad, because he's so influential in my life, and also Tiata, because she was such a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful leader for everyone, not just Waikato, not just Māori, but Pākehā as well. Yeah, I've just been so honoured to have had that experience.
In the work that you were doing in those early years to help shape the Raupatu settlement, Huakina development was in operation. That's where most of the environmental kind of kaupapa connected with the Trust Board was happening. What relationship did you have in particular with people that were involved in the environmental space at that time?
I think that's a good question, because if it wasn't for Huakina doing the Manukau tribunal claim back in 1984, most of what we could negotiate, or they set the platform for us. They basically said, this is, the tribunal said, no, the Raupatu is the cause of the issue around Manukau Harbour and Huakina claim, but they couldn't advance it because there was no, at the time, they couldn't go back retrospectively to the breach of the treaty. They could only do a contemporary claim. But having said that, the tribunal made a huge statement around the impact of the Raupatu as a consequence of what was happening. So we used that outcome, or that report, to put down as our foundation to the Raupatu claim.
There were key people around at the time who were heavily involved in the environmental space, the Manukau claim. What are your recollections of those people?
I remember the key people I recall was Nana Homahanek, of course. Very powerful, bit like Eva, very clear on what their position was, and very forceful in defending that position. There's also people like Carmen Kirkwood, who, again, without her, I don't think the claim, the settlement would be where we would not have got there. She's so strongly supportive of Sir Robert, but also the team. And their work in the environmental space also assisted us with our final redress, but also the ongoing outstanding claims around the river in particular. Without their work, we wouldn't have had proper river settlement either. Julie Wade was associated, I think, with Hercule at the time as well. Very strong. In fact, yeah, this woman. For me, one of the key players was Denise Henry. And she got involved, I think, because Hui Tamata in 1984, when your dad and your mum asked her to do some co-presenting or something like that, I can't recall. But she was sort of attacked by your dad to lead our legal team in the negotiations. And again, without her, we will not have got what we had. And what I admire most about Denise was, I'm only here to give advice, Shane, not to tell you what to do. I said, okay, you can accept my advice or not. But what she was very, very good at was, and again, back in the day, it was all new to everyone. We didn't know what we were doing. We just had to go with it. And she made what I call the Denise fish hooks to allow future generations to look at what wasn't achieved back then. How can we achieve it now based on what we couldn't do, but we didn't give up on, but we reserved for the future to pick up. And part of that was around, well, it's not full and final. There's no such thing as full and final. It's a legal fiction. We'll accept it, but we don't accept it. We'll accept it for the time, but as Sir Robert always said, well, one generation cannot bind another. So I'm hoping that this generation will revisit the settlement and say, well, what do we need to continue with? What do we need to finish? Because, as I said, the settlement's not perfect, but it was of the time and circumstance back then.
It must have been quite illuminating to work along someone like Denise Henare with the level of clarity, legal clarity, that she was able to bring to the negotiation process.
Oh, yeah, it was, her legal mind was so sharp. But again, she brought that humanity to it. And I felt sorry for her when we were negotiating the apology, because there was so much weight put on her to make sure we got it right. And she had to negotiate. We were negotiating down to the, every word, like, it was an imperial truth or colonial truth, the unjust or the illegal. So we had to really rely on Denise to get us to that position. But then, as I said, we had to make compromises.
But well worth the level of vigilance on the apology, because Waikato's the only settlement that was signed by Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, if I go back to the humanity of the settlement, the apology is the humanity. With Queen Elizabeth signing, we were such a bespoke settlement. Everything was unique. Only Ngāi got a relativity clause. And that's why, because we had one. We had what they had. But the whole, not even imagery, the whole whakapapa around Queen Elizabeth signing the apology and signing of the settlement goes right back to when the previous kings went to see Victoria to get resolution, but it took that generational shift to happen, and Queen Elizabeth signed and apologised for the wrong. And you can't recreate that. You can never get that. And I don't think any other tribe can ever achieve that, because it had to happen with us. It was destiny, in my view. I hope. Read my thesis.
Yes.